Well, we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Shireen Sherrard Johnson, who's professor and chair of English at Pomona College. She'll be speaking about illustration, publishing, and the female artists of the Harlem Renaissance. Just to provide a little background, illustration was an essential part of the toolkit of artistic activism endorsed and encouraged by the architects of the Harlem Renaissance and executed by a cadre of talented women artists, several of whom worked in multiple media. This talk focuses on the arresting and influential images created by Black female illustrators during the Harlem Renaissance from about 1919 to 1935 and the new Negro movement. It's a pleasure to introduce you to our speaker, Shireen Sherrard Johnson, who is a professor and chair of English at Pomona College. For 20 years, she taught at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and her research is primarily focused on Black female representation in mid-19th to early 20th century American literature and visual culture. She's the author of Portraits of the New Negro Woman, Visual and Literary Culture in the Harlem Renaissance, Dorothy West's Paradise, a biography of class and color, and she is editor of A Companion to the Harlem Renaissance. Her recent projects include the Cambridge Companion to the Black Body in American Literature, and Shireen was one of our advisors to Imprinted, Illustrating Race. And we look forward to working with her as the exhibition hopefully moves on to travel. Welcome, Shireen. We are so happy to have you with us.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that introduction. I'm excited to be here, and welcome to everyone joining us. I know on the East Coast it's almost lunchtime, but here in California it's early, so we might have some people from different spaces. Let's see. I'm going to give just an overview of just the important role that visual arts and culture played during the Harlem Renaissance, with an emphasis on the collaborative nature of what was produced during the era, especially through the periodicals and magazines that circulated through the times. And then definitely I will emphasize the role that women artists played, particularly their collaborative the collaborative nature of a lot of the works that are featured both in the Imprinted exhibit as well as in the catalog that was included alongside the exhibit. So I'll share some of the images that are from the catalog, but also I think maybe a couple of others just to give some background and emphasis on who some of these illustrators were. So as Stephanie mentioned, the Harlem Renaissance is the period we think of from around 1919, just after the First World War, to around the 1930s. 1939 is sometimes given as one of the final dates. A lot of us in the field like to talk about it as the long Harlem Renaissance, which gives us a sense of the continuity of Black art. I think there's a sense you don't want to think that the artistic expressions were just came out of nowhere or sui generis. There really was a long history of Black art through the 19th century, but the Harlem Renaissance still manages to be a very special period during the time coinciding with the new Negro movement. And even though the name Harlem is given to it because definitely that space in New York City was a locus of the Great Migration and of energy and artistic expression, this really was a period where you had artists and writers in many other urban settings as well. So Chicago, Washington, D.C., as well as Paris, other cities throughout the nation that were also engaged in this era of artistic activism during the New Negro movement. So Harlem is a shorthand for the era, but just know that you'll also hear terms describing this period like New Negro Renaissance as well. So just to give some situation as to the importance of visual images during this era, one of the images here you have is a cover or snapshot of the original or first edition of the New Negro Interpretation, which was edited by Professor Alain Locke who many people talk about as an architect of the Harlem Renaissance. It gathered many images together with lots of essays, poetry, really was a multimedia collection. And I just wanted to highlight it just because I think it sets the tone for the kind of interartistic exchange between the visual images and text, and also just how critical those visual images were, especially illustration from the early period. This is one of the plates that was included in this edition. If you are lucky enough to come across a first edition that has these beautiful illustrated portraits, they were by a German artist named Winold Reiss. And one of the things that's very striking about them is the poignancy and the seriousness and the dignity that is given to these images. One of the reasons why these images were so important during the era, and you might have heard about this in some of the earlier talks, was the level of stereotyping and negative portrayals of African-American subjects as often less than human, and especially female subjects as being either over-sexualized or ungendered, really not full human beings. And so this was one of the important aspects of what we call the print or the visual culture of the era, was to provide a visual counter narrative to those negative images. And so something like this image of the Brown Madonna is something this is an image that you would see repeated often, trying to cast Black women in these roles in which, again, they had dignity. This one is almost sublime. It has it's very similar to the Madonna and Child images that you would see in Europe or on church windows. It's partaking of a very long tradition of representing the idea of the Virgin Mother. So you'll see that the figure is also wearing a blue tunic, which would have been consistent with how images of the Virgin Mary were represented. So the artist is taking some of some of that iconography and sharing it. Often when I teach this and I share this image with my students, they always ask me, like, well, why is she looking away? And where, like, they pay a lot of attention to the gaze. And so we often have an interesting discussion about why the mother here seems somewhat disinterested. So, but Winold Reiss was a German artist, so he's not one of the African-American women artists that I'm going to talk about in detail today, and whose work is in the exhibit. So the first duo that I wanted to talk about here is Jessie Redmond Fawcett and Laura Wheeler Waring. So Jessie Redmond Fawcett was the literary editor of the Crisis magazine. And the very first image I showed, or the image that was up at the beginning, was a cover from the Crisis that I'll come back to later on. And there were 3 journals that really would have been there were many small journals that circulated during the time, but the Crisis, which was the journal of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, that would probably be one of the most prominent that would have been in people's homes, but others, including Opportunity, The Messenger, these were other journals, also smaller periodicals. One of the things about little magazine culture is it tends to be very ephemeral. So one of the special things about the Crisis is the NAACP is still around. You can access a pretty complete edition or sets of the Crisis, whereas with some of the other ones, they're harder to find. They didn't last as long. So we have a good sense of, from this collection, we have a good sense of what the covers looked like and what the illustrations were, and even to some extent who the illustrators are. You'll notice for some of these, I don't always know. And I know we have some biographical information on certain artists that were very prominent, but others, sometimes you just have a signature in the corner or their initials. So in this image, we have, I just wanted you to see them. So this is Jessie Redmond Fawcett over here, who's the editor, a novelist in her own right. But she was, as an editor, really together with W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the main editor of it. She was the literary editor, recruited and featured women illustrators in their pages. And if you can see from, here are some of the covers. I think both of these are actually by Laura Wheeler Waring. I'll come back to her. So she's in the corner here, and you see her with the tools of her trade, surrounded by images that she's painted here. So many of the illustrators also were artists in other mediums. So Laura Wheeler Waring was actually a fairly well-known and pretty successful in exhibiting her work given the constraints of the time. So it's interesting, I think, to think about her moving between different genres. Part of why I position her and Redmond Fawcett as a team is she illustrated several of Jessie Fawcett's short pieces. So Fawcett would publish short fiction in the crisis, and Laura Wheeler Waring would often add images to go along with that. But even when she wasn't working with Jessie Fawcett, she was one of the most featured illustrators on the covers of the crisis. Now, a lot of the covers that you'll see, and I'll come back more to Fawcett and Waring a little later. A lot of the covers of the crisis or other New Negro periodicals during the time would often have black and white photographs on the cover, very often of women, always, again, emphasizing positivity. So you would have pictures often of either families or often women who'd been in pageants. The emphasis was really on, again, dignity and bringing a positive light to shine on Black culture that would counter, again, the negative images that were circulating, especially through advertisement. But the illustrated covers tell a slightly different story than those black and white images. And you can see that in these covers, there was a level of creativity and experimentation that the artist often brought, and that was encouraged. You can see, I think, in both of these, Waring is drawing on elements of Egyptian art here with the geometric shapes. Some of this would have been work that she studied, but it also would have been work that she was imagining. You know, there's a sense of people talk about at this time, there was also a real fascination, not just in Black culture, but in Western culture in general with Egypt, but particularly for African-American cultures looking to a different tradition. So you can see in this image, some of this is also seen as described as Art Deco, and you can see a lot of the patterns here that she's included in the illustrations. The harp is, I think, really a truly unique image here, where you have the head that is reminiscent of some of those bust or mask of Nefertiti. Part of why there is this craze, sort of an aside with Egypt, was around the time, just before this period, where King Tut's tomb had been discovered. So that was a traveling exhibit. And so there were a lot of interest in that era. And so you can see that even with this mandate of wanting to represent Black culture and a positive light, and highlighting that artists were drawing from many other things, right, in the culture and society. One of the elements that is, I think, really interesting about the cover over here is, along with those, the elements that are drawn from North African or Egyptian art, is that the other symbology that Waring has included in the image. So you have the Atlantic pictured here. You can see the two continents, and most importantly, the ship with the sails here. So there's a way in which, even with this image on the side, is almost in conversation with the boat that is crossing, which it would evoke for many people, the Middle Passage, the relationship between the African continent and the Americas, and the transportation, the enforced transportation of enslaved human beings, right, to the United States, and as a beginning potentially, or you might even think of the way that the water appears there almost as the hyphen, right, between the two, and the ways in which in the image you can see how Waring's has tried to pick up the curves of the woman's body along with the way the water is shaped. So just some examples of the kind of latitude and experimentation and detail that some of the artists, and especially Waring, brought to these the covers of the Crisis. And again, the covers are wonderful, as a wonderful archive to look through. And again, since the focus here is on illustration, I wanted to show some of these alongside giving you a sense of Waring's work. As I mentioned, she and Fawcett in this image collaborated quite a bit, not just on Fawcett's short stories, but also on a project, a fairly large project that evolved out of the Crisis that was known as the Brownies Book. And the Brownies Book was a journal for children. It ended up being really one of the first publication, or African-American publication, geared towards specifically for children. So if there was a sense broadly that readers and people needed to see these images of themselves and have these organs that would circulate and share information, that was an urgency, especially for children. And so you can see this is the cover of one of the Brownies books here. Many of the covers often featured elements of springtime and renewal. That was even the case with a little bit of this cover here, the Crisis cover, but even with the Brownies book. So you'll have a lot of pictures of children. I saw many with the bunnies. This was common with the angel in the background. The little girl in the middle also looks very angelic. So again, the emphasis here on positive imagery, on trying to represent, but really trying to humanize Black children who are also subjected to the barrage of commodifying images, again, often not just dehumanizing images, but featuring them association with animals, almost in a way that equivocated or suggested that the children themselves were animals. So you can, and those are images that I don't include here, but several of them would often feature these young Black children either in peril, often in jungle scenes with running from an alligator or something like that. So part of these images was to present something, again, more whimsical. Here are just some examples of what you might have found in the Brownies book. So again, the image of these women on the street, they're actually pretty stylish. I'm here looking at a dog going through in the text here. Oh, I wanted to show, this is an example. There are lots of religious pieces in there, but here's an example of the ways in which the text and illustrations would work together. This is a poem from Jessie Fawcett. Again, the Easter theme, or these holiday themes, were pretty strong both in the Brownies book and in the Crisis. And so you have a poem here from Fawcett that has an accompanying illustration with the image of Christ with the children there. Again, a well-known or iconographic image of Christ leading the children with the halo behind the head. But there is shading, in this image, right? So there is a sense of trying to make this an image that is resonant or would be familiar or prominent or appreciated by African-American subjects. Before I get too far, before I get too far into the Brownies book, I did want to come back to the image that's here on the front. So this is an image from another prominent illustrator during the time who also wrote poetry and actually quite a bit of criticism about art and literature and early film. And her name was Gwendolyn Bennett, and you can see here on the bottom here. So this is not from the crisis. This is from the opportunity. So again, I'll come back to the Brownies book, but before leaving, Opportunity was another journal during the time. Why I wanted to show this image is it's one that you may have seen. It's a pretty popular image because some of the other more idyllic images of holidays or Easter, I wanted to show that there were also images that were still trying to offer, even as they were powerful and positive, also very expressive of sensuality, as making a space in the world for women to not only be presented as the Madonna figure that you saw before. And so this is one of those images. You do see that influence from artists like Aaron Douglas, who was an African-American artist who incorporated a lot of geometric shapes and also Egyptian aesthetics into his work. So you see some of that in the panel down here on the bottom where you have the silhouettes. There's one figure here in the middle who is wearing what might be construed to be a skirt, could be a grass skirt, but many people read this as a banana skirt in homage to Josephine Baker, the very talented and probably one of the most famous Black performers of the time, who performed in the Folies Bergère in Paris, and a very well-known dance that there was also film of, known as the Danse Sauvage, and that was also where she wore this banana skirt. So that would have been an iconic image, and Gwendolyn Bennett would have known that as well. She spent some time in Paris, as did Jessie Fawcett and Laura Wheeler Waring, directing her art, but also writing stories as well. So this element of these illustrators being skilled in more than just one artistic medium is another part of the story. So many of them who were both either painters, so they might be like Laura Wheeler Waring, a painter, but who also does illustrations. They might be someone like Gwendolyn Bennett, who is an illustrator, but who also writes stories. So this, again, collaborative effort either between artists or the idea of working and incorporating many different mediums was something that was common from the era. So I wanted to come back to the Brownies book. Again, this is just another image. So again, the Brownies book was the children's publication. This is an image of Toussaint Louverture, who was a hero from the Haitian Revolution. Just include it because so there are lots of images of women there, but I wanted to also include, they're also within the Brownies book, the book tried to create or include heroic images of Black subjects to be proud of, so heroes during the time. And this is one that really emphasizes that the Toussaint, dressed in his official uniform there, holding the sword, also shows that the Brownies book was very much in tune with trying to educate the children about the world, about Black culture beyond the United States. So there was this global emphasis that was also there. So you would see lots of different subjects, and I'll show you some other ones. This is Lois Mailou Jones, but I'm going to skip ahead to, okay, I'll go here. There were other subjects where they would feature images of children. There's an image of children learning from a school on the African continent. And again, those subjects are also featured as being in homes with families, not painted in a pejorative manner, right? So there was a sense of wanting to educate children about the world, about the kinds of figures and culture you might see throughout. So this image, it's, I think, a really lovely image of Lois Mailou Jones painting there with her cat. She's another illustrator from the time. Several of her works appeared either, if not in the Brownies book, but also in other children's publications. So in children's books, you would find she often illustrated there are two in particular. One was a book called Parthenia McBrown's Picture Poetry Book, and also Merrill Brown's Lily, May, and Dan, Children of the South. So Jones included some of her images in these books. And like Laura Wheeler Waring, she was also a painter. And in fact, probably is more well known for her paintings, both of figures, figurative painting, abstract painting. She also did a lot of textile work. So you can see, I'm going to show you some of her images next. You can see in this image, so this is the one over here that she illustrated for the children's book. There's her name, Lois M. Jones. You can see that her interest in creating patterns for textiles also found its way into her illustration. But this image is just another example of the importance that editors placed in these children's literature on the importance, again, of representing children as just as Black children, as human, as having homes, as, you know, not pictured as animals living in a natural space, but here's a child in a domestic space. She's very well cared for. You can see by both how she's clothed with the shoes and the emphasis in this on order and neatness, how the black and white linoleum floors, the squares, the checkered board of the squares being reflected in the jam jars on the shelf, and everything is in its place and it's very orderly. She's having tea here with the doll, and the doll and the girl are almost like mirror images of each other. So during, many of you might remember during the civil rights movement, when they were legislating the case to end segregation in Brown v. Board, that research from sociologists about used dolls and conducted experiments with Black children and asking them about which doll they preferred, the Black doll or the white doll. And they used some of that, the findings, to show the damage that how corrosive internalized racism can happen with children very early. And this was one of the exhibits or case studies that supported the case for desegregating schools. And it's something that in a sort of in recent memory, that same study has been redone. And it really just speaks to the prevalence of dominant or hegemonic iconography of whiteness being associated with the things that are what are seen as appealing or superior, normal, right? And so again, these books really early during that time was trying to offer a different perspective, one that would be more consonant with the worlds that children saw around them, around their lives. So this is this is the last image. And then I know that we want to have some time for questions, but this is also from the Brownies book. Again, it includes Jessie Fawcett's images there, or Jessie Fawcett's text again. But this one, the author, I think this is might be a different, no, it is also Laura. I was checking to think it was a different illustrator. This is also Laura Wheeler Waring. Again, another one of their collaborations. I always found this one interesting because it's a little more abstracted than some of the more realistic portraits, because you have the globe and the head, and again, images of children, of Black children in school learning about the world would have been, again, something important, although this one's entitled After School, and the text is more about the playfulness of maybe wanting to get away from doing schoolwork. But these kinds of pieces were, along with images like the Toussaint image, were the kinds of images that found themselves in the Brownies book. And that's where we have a lot of where we do have a lot of evidence of the work of Black female illustrators. The ones that I highlighted, Laura Wheeler Waring, Gwen Bennett, Lois Mailou Jones, again, those are some of the more well-known illustrators, but there were also many others whose names we know, women like Hilda Wilkinson Brown, Vivian Schuyler Key, Celeste Smith, to name a couple of others whose names you'll find, but we don't always know as much about them. And so I was trying to show and share pictures of some of the ones that we know about. I think I'll probably end there. I think that's a real overview of, again, the important role that illustrators played, and just a kind of a tour of some of the imagery and the work that you would find during the era.
Thank you so much, Shireen. That was a fascinating overview, and we really appreciate it. We've got a question from Gil Ashby. Gil is a really wonderful artist himself. He is a professor, or has been at the College for Creative Studies in Detroit. And Gil asks, were these styles developed by the artists, or was it the popular aesthetic of the times?
Mm-hmm. I think both, right? I think they were drawing from a lot of different influences, especially with something like Laura Wheeler Waring drawing on, again, Art Deco work that would have been popular. She would have seen it in magazines and in other illustrations. She would have seen certainly Aaron Douglas's work. So if you think about Douglas and his familiar with the murals and the pyramids and those geometric circles. So those were images that Waring would have seen. But I think also, yes, with her and developing her own aesthetic, she would have taken those influences and incorporated them into the images that she produced. And when she was working with Jessie Fawcett, they, part of their collaboration, they traveled together throughout Europe and in North Africa. And it's almost like you think about a foreign correspondent taking a photographer with them. In the case of Fawcett and Wheeler Waring, she took a visual artist, right? And so there's also a documentary element, I think, to some of those images, but but again, they're really varied. So yeah, I would say that it's both, that they're drawing on what they're seeing in other artists' work, but also developing their own signature style. I'm not always perfect with it, but I can often look and see, oh, that's probably Laura Wheeler Waring. She definitely has a distinctive style.
Thank you. Wonderful answer. Ayana says it's wonderful to learn of the women artists of the Harlem Renaissance. And I am wondering if you could say a little bit about what their experiences may have been, if you know. In other words, what kind of training were they able to receive, and how did they get their first jobs, and what might their day-to-day lives have been like working for publication at that time, if you have a sense of that?
Yeah, the idea of training, I mean, some of them, it really varied, right? Some of them definitely had formal, art school training. There were fellowships that they could apply to go study, like other women artists in Paris and Fontainebleau. Obviously, there were racial barriers to some of that study. And Augusta Savage was a sculptor, not an illustrator, but a sculptor during that time. And her story was very well known about how she won this fellowship, and then, it was taken from her, and there were concerns about who was she going to room with on the ship. So there were real, because of segregation, there were real barriers, I think, for female artists to get the kind of formal training that they would have liked to have gotten. And then after that, being able to find gallery representation. I mean, that was hard for Black, that was all hard for all artists during the time, doubly so for African-American artists. And so part of why these illustrations, I think, were important, it was a way for them to get their art out. Laura Wheeler Waring, again, she was an exception in many ways. She was able to have a show. She did have shows of her own, you would recognize her trajectory as an artist as being more similar to like an artist today, where, you would be you educated, and then you find like representation, and your work gets circulated. But for many of them, that would not have been the case. The Black colleges, of course, like Howard in particular, would have been a really important place to get training. Lois Mailou Jones ultimately did go back and teach there as well. So there was a kind of paying it forward of those aesthetics. Some were also self-taught. right? So not everyone had access and to that kind of training. In Harlem, at one point, Augusta Savage did have, there's some really amazing images of almost like a school where they're all working together, and you can see that there was with other sculptors. And so again, that's a different art form, but yeah. So I think people tried to create situations for gaining the expertise that they needed, but it was definitely challenging, and a lot of dependence on patrons to provide the funds for that kind of training. And then obviously the challenges of convincing people that you were convincing people to just bend the rules for them to be able to go. And there were just, I think, a lot of discouragement that people faced.
Thank you for that. We've got a great question from Emily Brody. She says, greetings from Oxford, UK. Thank you, Emily.
Oh, wonderful.
Is that you, Emily? Thank you for the amazing presentation. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about how class manifests in these images. I'm wondering if the construct of the politics of respectability plays a role.
Definitely. Yeah, this was a time where there was really no, now a lot of people are pushing back upon respectability politics. This was not that time. This was when they were very much seen as a way to achieve, as part of an uplift strategy. That's not to say that there weren't other routes to take during this time. This was also the period where you had a blues culture, which was a culture that I would say was more less conventional, more queer, right, in terms of music and such. So it's not as if there weren't some constraints in that regard, or there wasn't some conversation in that regard. But definitely, you can see that part of the crisis. If you think about the crisis as being supported by the NAACP, this was when Du Bois was really very much still advocating for the notion of the talented 10th, right? So there is a way in which the visual images are very consistent with trying to present like a middle class existence, right? Much of these, you did not see a lot of images of rural culture. That was something that people, it's not as if they didn't know that it existed, but they were trying to, and I think trying to counteract this with the rhetoric of newness. And there was, sometimes I would suggest even a kind of harmful dichotomy between the idea of the new and the vanguard being seen as urban, right? And so this notion of like the idea that the South was still fixed in a past that was static, which we know is not true, right? And there's a lot of work that shows that, again, even with that Harlem being the locus, that there were lots of interactions back and forth, and the influence of Southern and rural culture was often very much there. In some cases, there was a nostalgia for that culture, and you'd see that in some of the, I just showed a selection here, you can see that. But there was that idea of newness being associated with a kind of Afro-modern did have class implications. So yeah, I think you can see that from the images, and that certainly was there. And so yeah, definitely the politics of respectability were in operation. That first cover, though, why I wanted to show from the Gwendolyn Bennett, the one that, that one I felt pushed against that idea a little bit. So again, while you might have had, again, much of these images that were in line with the idea of respectability politics, every once in a while, right, you could see these alternatives. Also, some of the journals, one of the ones that was very short-lived here that was called Fire, there was just one issue of that, beautifully illustrated journal by some of the younger artists. Zora Neale Hurston had some writing featured in there. That the images there, I do think, are a little more experimental, right? And again, pushing back a little bit on what they perceived maybe as the constraints of what could have been construed as the elitist or salon culture of the Harlem Renaissance. So yeah, definitely a long answer there, but I think Emily is certainly getting at something that was present in the politics and the aesthetics of the era.
Thank you so much, Shireen. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you might be working on now. Are you continuing to research in this vein and to write about this topic?
So in terms of, I'm actually working on a podcast right now on Jessie Fawcett's work, but not the visual art, but more her novels, to try and draw some interest to revisiting these books, which while kind of thinking back to Emily's thought about the politics of respectability, definitely her novels focused on Black middle class life, but they also definitely focused on the ways in which those conventions were very constraining and suffocating to women artists in particular. So some of where this comes in is because I'm writing or thinking about Jessie Fawcett as a novelist, knowing her collaborations with artists also has an impact on the kind of writing she does. So that's one thing that I'm working on that still relates to this era. I also work and teach in Caribbean literature. And so I've really been interested in a lot of contemporary Caribbean art right now. So
It's
yeah.
very exciting. How do you feel bringing this amazing research to your students has impacted the way that they think about things and maybe the directions that they are taking now in their research?
Well, I think the students that I'm teaching are so attuned to reading visual images, right? So even much more, I think, than I do. They live in a world, right, where they are constantly engaging with the Instagram, the kind of continuous feed and the sort of pastiche, right? And the temporality is really different. So they have access to so many different images. So thinking back to the very first question about where are artists drawing their aesthetics, right? There's so many different places where you can find inspiration. And so working with the students during and showing them, again, the kinds of collaborative work that artists and writers engaged in, I think is inspiring. But they're also, I just find, really attuned readers of images and iconography. And so, bringing the work into the classroom, I often get some very surprising results or even just counter readings that they bring from just how well-versed they are and how to read visual images.
Thank you. That's an important point. We are so grateful for this wonderful talk and for all of the help and guidance you gave us during the course of creating the exhibition. Is there anything you'd like to add in closing or about the exhibition or just about your experience?
I hope that I'm really excited that this webinar has been allowing people maybe to see and engage with the exhibit for those who might not be able to travel, to see how some of these images in print culture are the resonance that they just continue to have, and also just you can just tracking through the transformation as you see when Black artists, right, start to represent themselves, right, in ways that are both and counter to, but also, alongside and in conversation with trying to recapture, power, right? The power of being able to center the Black subject. And that's something that I feel like, especially with some of the more experimental and avant-garde work that you see as you walk through the different rooms of the exhibits, that's really something, or a sense of change and transformation that you get. So this is just one, like the Harlem Renaissance era that I focus on, is just one snapshot of when those conversations were happening, but they continue to grow and build upon each other.
Thank you for those wonderful reflections. We so appreciate it.
Okay.
We have enjoyed having you this morning. We are going to take a short break of about half an hour. At 1 o'clock, we'll be back with Colette Gator and the artists of the Black Panther newspaper, so Malik Edwards, Gayla Sally Dixon, and Emery Douglas. So we look forward to that at 1 o'clock. In the meantime, we are going to be playing the video that we created for the Imprinted Illustrating Race exhibition. So you'll hear many commentators on the art as well. Enjoy your lunch break, and we'll look forward to seeing you back at 1 p.m. Shireen, thank you so much again for your wonderful talk.